Hi, this is Trev and welcome to my blog. Just a quickie this time. Ooh, sounds a bit rude. So, the most asked question in recent videos. Trev, what gauge metal do you use? Now, I'm going to try and answer this so that it gives you guys some new resources. Because this isn't a simple question to be answered. Now this is a sheet metal gauge. I bought this back in the 90s and it's the wrong one. I actually bought this off quite a reputable restoration tool supplier here in the UK, and they supplied me with something which was not really up to the job, because this is a non-ferrous, meaning it gauges metal that doesn't contain iron. Now you would just assume, well, I certainly did at the time, well, what difference does it make what material you're putting in to measure? Surely it doesn't make a difference. Well, it does, you see, because the problem is they've made gauges for all different materials and they all measure differently. Something else that's a bit unique to gauging metal is that the thinner the metal is, the higher the gauge number. So it's kind of counterintuitive, it kind of runs the wrong way. And also it's a non-linear measurement, meaning that it has no scientific standardized measurement. It doesn't actually, you know, if it says 20, as in 20 gauge, that 20 doesn't actually stand for anything as a measurement. There's no standardization. To make things even more confusing, there's multiple gauges. So there's the B&S gauge made by Brown and Sharp back in 1850 something or other, and it's also known as the AWG gauge, or the American wire gauge. Now people from America, this is probably the gauge you'll be using. Now the British gauge is the SWG gauge, which is the standard wire gauge. There's also the Bristol gauge, which is used in the UK, and that's more often than not used to gauge hypodermic needles and things like that, but also that can also be used to gauge other things, because it could be just used, you know, we use the Bristol wire gauge, it's often used. Also, I noticed a lot of people using a stainless steel gauge, which is completely different from a carbon steel gauge. This, like I said, this is a non-ferrous metal gauge, which is different from the other gauges. There's a carbon steel gauge, there's a stainless steel metal gauge, and there's a galvanized steel metal gauge. And also there's people gauging things in aluminium, and apparently a gauge for aluminium doesn't exist. So confused you will be. So what I propose to do is seek a fairly straightforward solution to our predicament, because people keep saying to me, what gauge did you use, Trev? Well, that's a nonsense question really, because if I'm making something up, I'm making it up for the project I'm working on, and you should do the same. There's no good you buying the metal that I'm using, the thickness of metal that I'm using, that I'm making my stuff out of, because I'm making it up for the vehicle I'm working on at the time. And you know, you ought to do the same. So I have a bit of a proposal to put to you guys, so that this repeat question doesn't keep coming to me, or I can at least direct people to this video to help them out. Because what I don't want you guys doing is I don't want you guys rushing off and buying the wrong material because I've told you something which isn't correct, because I've said it's 20 gauge and you're in America and your 20 gauge is different from the British 20 gauge, of course dependent upon which gauge you're actually using, because even steel stockholders use different gauges. I mean, I went to buy some box section once of a metal supplier just up the road from where I live, and they used a stainless steel gauge to gauge carbon steel box section. I just couldn't get my head around that. So anyway, when I say to people, what I do is I measure mine in millimeters. Of course, people from America, they don't measure, or they often don't use millimeters, because they're not into the whole metric system thing. So what I propose is for you to go off and get yourselves a cheap tool called a digital Vernier caliper. So this is a digital Vernier caliper. I'm sure you've all seen one of these before. I bought this very cheap at one of these funny supermarket places. I think it was Aldi. I think it was about £7. In fact, I've got a couple. I use one for marking out my steel, and I use the other one for measuring things for obvious reasons. So let's measure something. So let's turn it on. So I'll turn it on, zero it. I've got this steel rule. What I'll do is I'll measure this steel rule. Okay, let's see what that is. Can we see what that is? We're talking 1.19. 1.19, that's pretty close to 1.2. In fact, only 0.01 millimeters away. So we're going to call that 1.2. Well, to me, 1.2, 18 gauge. Not to people probably in America, because they're probably using the AWG and I'm using the standard wire gauge. And this is, see, this is where the confusion comes in. But if I can give you a measurement in millimeters, then I can also give it you in inches. Okay, so 1.2. You'll always have a little button that will say inches and millimeters. All you've got to do, for you guys in America, is just press the button and it'll instantly change to inches, and then it'll give you the measurement in inches. So what I'm really saying is, you're not measuring a ruler, you're measuring a part of your car. So you're cutting a part of your car out that you're trying to repair. So cut a section of the metal away that's not rusty, and then measure it with a vernier caliper, and then you will get the true thickness with your vernier caliper of what that is. Then you can go to your steel stock holder and you can then tell them the measurement in inches, if that's what they're going to deal with, and they'll then be able to convert it into a gauge. So I mean, on this one, I think this one's actually, this gauge, I think this is actually closer to the American than certainly than the British anyway. So, well, 0.45 is 17, so that would be 17 gauge on this. And I know for a fact that 1.2 in the UK would be classed as 18 gauge. 1.2 18 gauge, 20 gauge is 0.9 millimeters. That's why I tell people 0.9, and then we get this confusion about, well, I don't know what 0.9 means. So hopefully this video will help to iron out those confusions, and what you can do is just go to your steel stock holder and they'll have a chart. They'll definitely have a chart there, and they'll tell you what gauge they're using. So they'll tell you that it's the American wire gauge or the standard wire gauge or whatever wire gauge. Don't forget, if you're making things out of different materials, then they're going to use different gauges for different materials, but there'll always be a chart and it'll always have the measurements written across, normally in millimeters and in inches, and then it'll tell you the gauge, and at the top of the chart it'll tell you whether it's the American wire gauge or the standard wire gauge or the Bristol wire gauge or blah blah blah, whatever it is, it'll tell you. I'm sure there's more than I've mentioned here, and it's a deeply confusing subject which is a bit needless these days, really. I think that they should just standardise it all. There's lots of these crossovers to do with weights and measures. I remember working out cubic weights are different between Britain and America, and of course our billion is a million traditionally, although we're now using 1,000 million, and of course the Americans always been 1,000 million is a billion. And I think some scientists a few years back, there was some space exploration thing and they didn't do the conversion right. They used the American billion instead of the British, or they used the British instead of the American, and I think something ended up crashing into Mars because they hadn't worked out the distances properly. So even rocket scientists get confused with this kind of thing. Anyway, I hope that kind of clarified a few things for you guys. The other thing I'll say as well is people keep asking me about hot rolled and cold rolled. Well, when you're making stuff for bodywork, it's always going to be cold rolled steel. Cold rolled steel is like a nice bright silvery colour, and the hot rolled stuff has got a blackened, bluey blackened crust on the surface. which actually stops it from going rusty quite well. It'll be things like angle iron and more to do with ironwork really that's hot rolled. So I don't know where people get this confusion from about what's kind of steel. So basically you just want to go for basic cold rolled mild steel, and then as I've just explained to you in the video, you can get the gauges. It reminds me a little bit of the film Pulp Fiction. Do you know what they call a quarter pounder with cheese in Paris? What, you mean they don't call it a quarter pounder with cheese? No, man! They don't know what the f*** a quarter pounder is. They got the metric system. They call it a Royale with cheese.
Royale with cheese.